Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the incredible shrinking economy. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is The Economy Ruins Everything, Episode 5. Alright, now, in the news media, the favorite topic of economists and economic reports is the expansion of our GDP, the growing gross domestic product. But I contend that it's not actually growing. Now, granted, if you compare GDP only to itself, then in relation to itself, it is growing. But the economy has more in it than just GDP. There's a big pile of debt and an even bigger pile of financial assets. And in relation to those two things which draw their energy from GDP, GDP is shrinking. And I'm going to show you now how that is. Now, I specialize in designing and making scale representations of items both real and imaginary. And in this case, I have a cube. It's a 1 inch tall, 1 inch wide, and 1 inch deep cube. And this cube is painted gold to represent gold. Actually, $1 trillion worth of gold. In making my models, I've also made a sphere, which is the same cubic volume as the 1 inch by 1 inch by 1 inch cube. So this sphere is 1 cubic inch in volume. And it also represents $1 trillion. All right, so I'm going to remove the cube and leave the sphere. Now, let's introduce a new sphere. This little green sphere represents the GDP in 1948, which was $280,366 million. So this is a small fraction of 1 trillion. Next, we're going to introduce debt for 1948. And that would be this little sphere here. Notice that it's larger than the GDP. In this case, it's $368,230,000,000. Next, I'd like to introduce a new sphere. This one representing financial assets in 1948. And at the same scale of 1 cubic inch equaling $1 trillion, this sphere is slightly smaller than the $1 trillion sphere and represents $778,442,000,000. All right, so we have 1948 represented right here. These are scale models, with the scale being 1 cubic inch equals $1 trillion. Okay, just to review, GDP was $280 billion and some change. The debt was $368 billion and some change, and the financial assets were $778 billion and some change. All right, so now I'm going to introduce you to 75 years later. So this is the $1 trillion 1 cubic inch sphere of gold. And this is the representation of GDP, debt, and financial assets in 1948. Here is the representation of financial assets in 2023, which is 75 years later. And it is a profound size difference. This is $119 trillion in financial assets. This is the 2023 representation of debt. In this case, we have $73.8 trillion. And then this little guy right here is GDP. And GDP in 2023 was $28.9 trillion. Now, these are not all going to fit in the frame, are they? Yeah, they will. Let's move that over. There we go. All right, now, you might be wondering why 1948's GDP is green and 2023's GDP is orange. Well, the reason why is because I thought it would be interesting to encase GDP in debt like so, and then also in financial assets. And there we go. Now this is the same scale in the volume. This is $1 trillion in volume, and obviously all three of these added together is much more than in 1 trillion, and it shows right there. All right. And this is what 2023 looks like when the debt and the financial assets are wrapped around it. Now, an interesting thing happened. When I took this small model of 1948 and I blew the entire volume up to this same volume as 2023, I found something very interesting happened. This is what it looks like if everything inside of 1948 expanded at the same proportions to fit within the same volume as 2023 here. And what came out of that was something that surprised me, because it's pretty obvious that our economy here in the orange is much smaller than it should have been if everything would have remained in proportion. If debt had remained in proportion to GDP and GDP stayed in proportion to financial assets, all of that. The difference in volume between the relative size 2023 and the real size 2023 is $8 trillion. So we're actually $8 trillion smaller than we should be. Right, this is one of the clues. This is one of the things that set me off on this trail of finding out what the hell is wrong with our economy. And obviously, these two layers are growing. And this one is shrinking relative to the other two. The pattern's very clear. Over time, this will shrink even further relative to the other two until it is a tiny thing. This is financial slavery. This is a dwindling wealth in the economy, squeezing everything in order to pay for what this blue ball represents, which is financial assets. This is what our entire economy has been built around, is creating and sustaining the compounded interest exponential growth model of financial assets. But this shocked me when I first saw it in my models, and I had to make the real thing so that I could show you with something I could hold in my hands rather than on a computer screen. All right, that's it for now. See you in the next video.